Part 1. A cold night. A small kindness. The wind was sharp that night. It felt like it could cut through my skin. I pulled my thin jacket tighter around me and waited at the bus stop. It was almost 9 o'clock. Brooklyn was quieter than usual. Snow was falling slowly from the dark sky. My name is Nora. I work as a bookstore assistant, not far from here. It is a small store filled with old wooden shelves and the smell of paper and coffee. Most nights, I like walking home, but tonight was too cold. I needed the bus. I stamped my feet to keep warm. I looked down the empty street. No bus lights, just cold air and silence. Then I saw him, a man sitting on the bench near the street lamp. His head was down. His coat was thin and full of holes. He had no gloves, no hat, only a small tired backpack at his feet. At first, I looked away. New York teaches you not to stare. But something about him made me look again. His hands were red from the cold. His shoes were wet. Yet he sat so still, like he had been there forever. I reached into my bag. I had a half sandwich from lunch, and my old scarf. I held them in my hands and hesitated. People say not to talk to strangers, but something in my heart moved. Maybe it was the way he sat. Maybe it was the way he looked lost, even though he wasn't asking for help. I took a breath, then I walked toward him. "Hi," I said softly. He looked up. His eyes were blue and tired, but kind. He didn't say anything, just looked at me as if surprised. Anyone could see him. I held out the sandwich first. "It's turkey and cheese." I said, "It's still good. I'm not that hungry." He hesitated, then took it slowly, as if afraid it was a trick. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken much lately. I smiled, trying not to show how cold I was. Then I took off my scarf and held it out. "You need this more than I do." He shook his head at first. "You'll freeze," he said. I shrugged. "I'll be fine. The bus will come soon." Slowly, carefully, he took the scarf. His hands brushed mine for a second. They were ice cold. He wrapped the scarf around his neck. His shoulders relaxed a little, like the small warmth gave him hope. "My name's Thomas," he said after a moment. "Nora," I said. We sat together in silence. Snow fell on the sidewalk, soft and white. Somewhere far away, a car horn sounded. But here, under the street lamp, it felt like a different world. A quiet world made only of snow breath and two strangers trying to stay warm. After a while, the bus came. Its headlights lit up the street. I stood up, brushing snow off my jeans. "Will you be all right?" I asked. Thomas gave a small smile. "I'm used to the cold." I didn't want to leave him there, but the bus driver was already honking. I hesitated, then ran to the bus. I looked back once. Thomas was sitting there, scarf around his neck, watching the snow fall. As I sat down on the bus, I reached into my pocket and found something. It wasn't mine. A small folded paper. I must have picked it up when I grabbed the sandwich. Curious, I opened it carefully. It was a drawing, a child's drawing. Simple, with stick figures. A man, a woman, and a small child, all holding hands. Above them was a bright yellow sun and a big red heart. At the bottom, written in shaky letters, were the words, "I love you, Daddy." I stared at the paper for a long time. My heart felt heavy and warm at the same time. This wasn't just a hungry man. Thomas had a story, a family, a life. As the bus rumbled through the snowy streets, I held the drawing close to my chest. I didn't know how, but I knew this. I had to find him again. I had to give him back more than a scarf. I had to give him back hope. Part 2. The Drawing Left Behind. The next morning, the city was still cold and gray. Snow covered the streets like a soft, heavy blanket. I sat by the small window in my apartment, holding the child's drawing in my hands. I traced the little stick figures with my finger, a family smiling under a bright sun. So simple, so full of love. It made my chest ache. I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. Where was he now? Was he still sitting at that lonely bus stop? Was he cold? Was he hungry? I had met many people living on the edge during my time in the city. Some asked for help, some didn't. Thomas was different. He hadn't asked for anything. He had accepted my sandwich and scarf like they were treasures. Like kindness was something rare. I looked at the drawing again, the small words at the bottom. "I love you, Daddy," pulled at my heart. Whoever made this picture loved him once. Maybe still did. I had to find him. I didn't know how. I didn't even know his last name. Just Thomas, just tired blue eyes, in a quiet, "Thank you." I grabbed my coat, slipped the drawing into my bag, and headed out. The bookstore was closed for the day because of the snowstorm. I had time. I had hope. First, I went back to the bus stop. It was empty now. Only footprints in the snow showed that someone had been there. I sat on the cold bench and thought, where would he go? Where would I go if I had nothing but a backpack and a broken heart? A few blocks away was a small church. They had a food kitchen. I had donated books there. Once, maybe someone had seen him. I hurried through the snow. My boots were wet. My fingers were numb, but I didn't care. Inside the church, the smell of soup and bread filled the air. A few people sat at tables, eating quietly. Volunteers in warm sweaters moved between them, offering smiles and hot meals. A woman with gray hair stood near the door. She smiled when she saw me. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked. I held up the drawing, feeling a little silly. "I'm looking for someone. His name is Thomas. He was sitting at the bus stop last night. Maybe he came here." The woman took the drawing gently, studying it. "Thomas," she said softly. "Yes, I know him. He's a kind soul. Helps out sometimes, even when he has little himself. He was here this morning, helping carry boxes." My heart jumped. "Is he still here?" She shook her head. "No, but he usually comes back around lunchtime. If you wait, you might see him." I sat down at one of the long tables. My hands shook a little, not from the cold, but from nerves. What would I say to him? Would he even want to see me? Time passed slowly. People came and went. Volunteers laughed softly in the kitchen. Outside, the snow kept falling, turning the world into a white, silent dream. Finally, the door opened and the cold rushed in. I looked up. It was him. Thomas walked in, head down, snow on his shoulders. He shook it off like an old dog, then smiled at the woman at the door. That smile, it was small, tired, but real. He hadn't seen me yet. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked toward him. "Thomas," I said. He looked up, surprised. His blue eyes widened when he saw me. For a moment, he said nothing. "Nora," he said at last. His voice was warm, like the soup steaming in the kitchen. I pulled the folded drawing from my bag and held it out to him. "You dropped this," I said. He took it with careful hands. He stared at it for a long time. His fingers traced the tiny figures, the heart, the shaky letters. For a moment, I thought he might cry, but he just closed his eyes and breathed deeply. "Thank you," he whispered. I thought it was lost. We sat down together at a small table by the window. He tucked the drawing carefully into his jacket pocket, like it was the most precious thing he owned. "Is it your child's?" I asked gently. He nodded. "My daughter Ella. She made it for me when she was 5. She's older now. I don't see her much." I didn't ask why some stories are written in the lines of a face in the quiet between words. Instead, I smiled. "It's a beautiful drawing." He smiled too, a little sad. "She always said we were a team. Me, her, and her mom." I waited. "My wife passed away 3 years ago." He said, "After that, things fell apart. I left my company. I didn't know who I was anymore." "You had a company?" I asked, surprised. He chuckled softly. "New Dawn. Maybe you've heard of it." I stared at him. Everyone in the city knew. New Dawn. It was one of the biggest companies helping small businesses grow online. "You're Thomas Reed," I whispered. He nodded. I was before everything. I looked at him. Really looked. Not as a tired man in a broken coat. Not as a stranger at a bus stop, but as someone who had built dreams and lost them. "You still are," I said. "You're still Thomas Reed." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a small light come back into his eyes. Not big, not bright, but real. And in that moment, sitting at a wobbly table with a man who had lost everything, but still smiled, I knew this was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning. Part 3. Finding him again. The snow kept falling outside the small church. Inside, the world felt warmer, softer, like time had slowed down. Just for us, Thomas and I sat together by the window. He wrapped his hands around a cup of coffee, letting the steam rise to his face. I sipped hot cocoa from a chipped mug, feeling the heat spread slowly through my frozen fingers. We didn't speak much at first. Sometimes silence can say more than words. I watched the way Thomas looked at the drawing tucked safely in his jacket pocket, like it was a part of him, a memory he could not leave behind. After a few minutes, he looked at me and smiled gently. "You didn't have to find me," he said. "Most people wouldn't. I wanted to," I answered simply. It didn't feel right to leave it like that. Thomas nodded. He stared out the window, watching the snow turn the city into a sea of white. Then he spoke again. I wasn't always like this, he said. Cold, tired, invisible. I know, I said. You built New Dawn. He gave a small laugh. Yes, once I had dreams, big ones. I wanted to make a place where small people had a big voice. I wanted to help. And you did, I said. Everyone knows New Dawn. He looked down at his coffee. It's not mine anymore. Not really. I left it behind. Why? I asked softly. Thomas took a long breath. His voice was low and slow, like a story told too many times. My wife Anna was my partner in everything. She believed in New Dawn before anyone else did. When she died, it felt like all the color left the world. I tried to keep going, for Ella, for the company, but every day I felt more lost. I started making mistakes, hurting people without meaning to. I didn't want to turn bitter, so I left. I gave most of it away to people I trusted. I thought maybe if I disappeared, I could find peace. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with something raw and real. But peace never came, just cold nights and empty streets. I wanted to say something to make it better. But what do you say to a man who has lost so much? I reached out and touched his hand, lightly. He didn't pull away. You still have something, I said. Kindness. It's rare. He smiled a little stronger this time. Maybe that's enough. We sat there, letting the coffee grow cold between us. Finally, he spoke again. What about you, Nora? Why help a stranger at a bus stop? I thought about it. About the long nights working at the bookstore, the quiet walks home, the way the city sometimes made you feel small, even when you were surrounded by millions of people. Because once, I said, someone helped me. A stranger. When I first moved to Brooklyn, I got lost in the snow. I was scared, cold, ready to give up. A woman found me, gave me a coat, and walked me home. She said, kindness is a circle. It comes back. I guess I wanted to keep the circle going. Thomas looked at me with something new in his eyes. Not sadness, not loneliness. Something lighter, like hope. He took a deep breath and set down his mug. I don't have much to give, he said. No big office, no fancy suits, just an old man and a broken past. You have more than you think, I said. You have stories. You have heart. He laughed softly. Maybe that's enough. We talked for a little longer. About books, about Ella, about small dreams and second chances. I learned he loved old movies and hated black coffee. I told him about my bookstore and my dream to open a reading room for kids someday. When the snow outside began to slow, Thomas stood up. I should go, he said. Thank you, Nora, for the scarf, the sandwich, the drawing, for seeing me. I stood too, not wanting the moment to end. Will you be all right? He nodded. I'll find a way. I watched him pull the scarf tighter around his neck, the child's drawing safe in his pocket. I wanted to ask him to stay, to meet again, to not vanish back into the cold city, but fear kept my mouth closed. He smiled one last time and walked toward the door. The bell above it jingled as he left. Snowflakes blew in after him, dancing in the air like tiny white birds. I stood there, feeling the emptiness rush back. But then, just before the door closed, Thomas turned. "Hey, Nora," he said. "Yes." He smiled. "Maybe I'll see you again." And with that, he stepped into the snow, leaving only footprints behind. I pressed my hand against the cold glass window and watched him disappear into the falling white. Maybe I would see him again. Maybe kindness really was a circle. And maybe this was only the beginning of something much bigger than I could understand. Part 4. A New Beginning Offered. The next few days passed slowly. I went back to work at the bookstore. I unpacked new books, wiped dusty shelves, and smiled at customers. But my mind was somewhere else. It was outside, walking in the cold, wondering where Thomas had gone, wondering if I would ever see him again. Every time the doorbell above the shop rang, I looked up, hoping it would be him. It never was. Just busy people with shopping bags and tired faces. Life moved on around me. But inside, I felt like I was standing still. One evening, just before closing time, I heard the bell ring again. I was tired. I didn't even look up at first. I stacked the last book on the shelf and wiped my hands on my apron. "Nora," a voice said. I froze. I knew that voice. I turned around slowly. Thomas stood at the door, snow dusting his shoulders, the scarf I gave him still around his neck. I smiled so wide, it almost hurt. "You came back," I said. He laughed softly. "I told you maybe I would." I walked over, my heart beating too fast. "How did you find me?" I asked the woman at the church. She said you worked at a bookstore nearby. I visited 3 before I found the right one. I laughed. "I'm glad you did." Thomas looked around at the tall shelves and warm lights. "It's nice here," he said. I nodded. "It's small, but it feels like home." He smiled, but there was something serious in his eyes, too. He shifted the backpack on his shoulder. "I was wondering," he said slowly, "if you had time for coffee, or maybe dinner." My cheeks warmed. "I'd love that." We closed the shop together. I grabbed my coat and bag, and we walked down the street to a small diner around the corner. It was cozy inside, with old red booths and the smell of fresh pie in the air. We sat in a corner booth, ordered hot chocolate and grilled cheese sandwiches. For a while, we just talked about nothing, about everything. I told him about my favorite books. He told me about Ella's love for drawing and how he used to read her bedtime stories about brave princesses and talking animals. After a while, he grew quiet. He looked out the window at the falling snow, then back at me. "I have an idea," he said. I waited. "I still have some connection to New Dawn." He said, "Not in the offices, not in the business side, but there's a small team that runs the heart of the company, charity work community programs. It's called the New Dawn Outreach." I listened carefully. "They need someone new," he said, "someone who understands kindness, someone who doesn't just see numbers, but people." I blinked. "Me." He nodded. "You see people, Nora. You saw me when no one else did." I didn't know what to say. My chest felt tight, but not in a bad way. In a way that said, maybe my life was about to change. but I work at the bookstore. I said, I'm not special. You are, Thomas said simply. You don't have to be rich or famous to change lives. You just have to care. I looked down at my hands. I thought about the cold night at the bus stop, about the drawing in my bag, about the scarf around his neck. Maybe kindness really could open new doors. What would I do? I asked. You would help design programs for people in need, organize events, find small ways to make big differences. I smiled. It sounded beautiful. It sounded like something that mattered. Thomas leaned across the table, his eyes soft but serious. I'm not offering you a job because I feel sorry for you. He said, I'm offering it because you already do the work. You already make the world better. The waitress brought our food. We ate slowly, smiling between bites. The diner lights reflected on the window, mixing with the falling snow outside. When we finished, Thomas walked me back to the bookstore. We stood under the awning, the snow falling gently around us. Think about it, he said. No pressure. I will, I promised. He smiled, that same small, warm smile I had seen the first night. Good night, Nora, he said. Good night, Thomas. He turned and walked away, his figure slowly blending into the snowy street. I watched him go, feeling a new kind of warmth inside me. Not from coffee, not from the diner, but from hope. Maybe the circle of kindness was bigger than I ever thought. And maybe it was carrying me toward something I never expected to find. Part 5. Healing the company, healing themselves. I took a few days to think about Thomas's offer. I walked the snowy streets of Brooklyn, thinking about my life, my small apartment, my job at the bookstore. I loved the bookstore. It had given me a place when I had none. But deep inside, I knew I wanted to do more. I wanted to help people the way someone had once helped me. Maybe this was my chance. I called Thomas on a Sunday morning. My hands shook as I dialed his number. When he answered, his voice was warm. I'll do it, I said. I could almost hear his smile through the phone. You won't regret it, Nora. On Monday, I started at New Dawn Outreach. The building was tall and modern, made of glass and steel. It felt big, almost too big for someone like me. But inside the outreach floor was different. It was filled with light green plants, colorful walls. People smiled when they passed each other. It didn't feel cold. It felt alive. Thomas met me at the front desk. He wore a clean jacket, now not fancy, but new. He looked healthier, stronger, but still had the same kind smile. He showed me around, introducing me to the small team. There were only 7 of us. Everyone worked on programs that helped small schools, local businesses, food kitchens, shelters. It was beautiful work. Thomas didn't act like a boss. He sat with us, listened to ideas, helped when needed. He still had a quiet sadness about him, but he didn't hide anymore. He was rebuilding, just like the people he wanted to help. My first project was simple, creating thank you days for local schools, a day to thank teachers, janitors, bus drivers, a day to remind people they mattered. I loved every minute of it. Every day, I learned something new. How to plan events, how to speak in meetings, how to believe my small voice could make a difference. Thomas and I grew closer too. We had lunch together most days. Usually, simple sandwiches or bowls of soup in the small break room. Sometimes we sat on the rooftop garden and watched the city breathe. He told me stories about New Dawn's beginning, how he and Anna had dreamed it up in a small apartment with a broken heater and no furniture, how they had believed kindness could be part of business, how he had lost that belief for a while after Anna died. "You reminded me," he said once, his voice soft, "that people still care." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled and passed him a cup of coffee. Other days, he asked about my dreams. I told him about wanting a reading room for kids, a place filled with books and soft chairs and laughter. "You could do it," he said, "one step at a time." It wasn't all easy. Some days the work was heavy. Some days the stories we heard of loss, hunger, loneliness made it hard to sleep at night. But every morning I woke up with a reason to get out of bed. Every day I felt like my heart grew a little bigger. Thomas changed. Too little by little, the tired lines on his face faded. He smiled more. He laughed, sometimes real laughter that filled the room. He started wearing a small silver ring on a chain around his neck. Anna's ring, he told me, a part of his past he could carry with love, not pain. One afternoon, after a long meeting, we stood together by the big windows. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. "You know," Thomas said, "the outreach team has never been stronger. It's because you believe in people." I said. He shook his head gently. "It's because you reminded me how." I looked at him, and for a moment, the world outside disappeared. Just him, me, and the golden light between us. I realized then that I wasn't just helping New Dawn heal. I was helping Thomas heal too. And somewhere along the way, without even meaning to, he was healing me. The bookstore girl who gave away a scarf. The tired man who had once built dreams. We were building something new now, something quiet, steady and strong, something that felt a lot like hope. Part 6, The Kindness Day and Confession. Spring came slowly to the city. The snow melted into rivers that ran along the sidewalks. Tiny green buds appeared on the trees outside the New Dawn building. People smiled more. The air felt softer. Inside New Dawn Outreach, there was new energy too. Our programs were working. More schools signed up for thank you days. More shelters received donations. More small businesses found support. Kindness was growing little by little, just like the flowers outside. One afternoon, Thomas called the whole outreach team into the meeting room. He looked excited, like a boy with a secret. "I have an idea," he said, smiling. "I want to create a special event, a day where we celebrate kindness inside the company, a day where we stop talking about money and start talking about heart." Everyone leaned forward, interested. "We'll call it Kindness Day," he said. Simple, but powerful. I felt a warm glow in my chest. This was the Thomas I believed in, not a man who chased success, a man who chased meaning. We spent weeks planning the event. We wrote small notes to leave on every desk, thanking people for small things they had done. We set up boards where employees could write messages of gratitude. We organized a lunchtime event with music, laughter, and stories of kindness from around the company. On the morning of Kindness Day, the whole New Dawn building buzzed with excitement. People smiled at strangers, held open doors, shared coffee and jokes. The walls were covered in colorful notes filled with simple words. Thank you for helping me with my project. Thank you for listening when I needed it. Thank you for smiling every morning. At noon, we gathered in the large, open space on the outreach floor. Thomas stood in front of everyone, holding a small microphone. I watched him from the back of the room, my heart full. He looked around at all the faces, all the hope. Today, he said, we celebrate something bigger than profit. We celebrate the simple moments that change lives. He paused his eyes, finding mine across the room. I want to tell you a story. He said, a few months ago, I was sitting at a bus stop. I was cold. I was lost. I didn't know who I was anymore. Then, someone sat down next to me. She didn't know my name. She didn't know my past. She didn't ask for anything. She just gave me a sandwich, a scarf, and a smile. The room was silent. That small act of kindness reminded me that people still care. Thomas continued, it gave me the strength to believe again, to hope again. He smiled, and for a moment he looked straight at me. Kindness doesn't always look big. Sometimes it's small. A scarf, a sandwich, a moment. But it can change everything. He stepped back, and the room erupted into applause. I wiped a tear from my cheek before anyone could see. After the event, people gathered to talk and laugh. Music played softly in the background. The air was filled with happiness. I stood by the window, watching the spring sun pour over the city. I didn't notice Thomas walking up behind me. You did this, he said gently. I shook my head. We all did. He smiled. You started it that night at the bus stop. I looked at him, my heart pounding. I never believed in fate, he said. But maybe, I do now. He took a deep breath, like he was gathering all his courage. Nora, he said, I don't just want to thank you. I don't just want to work with you. He stepped closer, his voice low and shaking just a little. I want to build something with you, a life, a future. I stared at him speechless. Will you walk into the future with me? He asked. I felt my throat close up with emotion. I nodded. Yes, I whispered. He smiled, the brightest, most beautiful smile I had ever seen. The spring sun shone on us, and for the first time in a long time, I believed in new beginnings. Kindness had brought us together, and now it would carry us forward. Part 7. A small, beautiful wedding. We didn't want a big wedding. We didn't want fancy flowers or golden rings. We wanted something simple, something real, just like the way we found each other. Thomas suggested the community garden near New Dawn. It was a small place hidden between two tall buildings. In spring, it bloomed with yellow daffodils, red tulips, and soft green grass. It felt right, like a quiet corner of the world, just for us. We invited only a few people. The outreach team, some close friends from the bookstore, a few people from the church. No suits, no gowns, just laughter, warm hugs, and soft music played by a boy with a guitar. Thomas wore a simple gray jacket. I wore a white dress my friend had sewn for me, with tiny blue flowers stitched along the hem. Around my neck, I wore the scarf I had given him that cold night. It was old now, a little worn, but full of memories. Thomas carried something too, a small frame with Ella's drawing inside, the stick figures, the big heart, the bright sun. He placed it on a small table next to us, like a silent blessing from the past. When we stood under the wooden arch covered in vines, Thomas took my hands gently in his. "I found hope because of you," he said. "I found home because of you," I whispered. We made simple promises to be kind, to listen, to believe in each other, even when the world grew cold again. There were no grand speeches, only soft words and full hearts. When we kissed, the garden around us seemed to glow. The flowers, the sky, even the old bricks of the buildings felt alive. Later, we all sat on blankets, eating sandwiches and laughing. There was no fancy cake, only small pies and cups of sweet tea, but it felt richer than any gold. As the sun set, Thomas and I sat on a bench, hand in hand, watching the sky turn pink and gold. The old scarf, the child's drawing the cold night at the bus stop, everything had led to this moment. A life built not on riches, but on kindness, and it was more beautiful than I ever dreamed. Ending reflection. Kindness changes everything. Sometimes life changes in the smallest moments. A cold night, a tired man, a simple scarf. I didn't know then that giving away my warmth would bring me a lifetime of love. I didn't know that a single act of kindness could open a door to a future I had never dared to dream about. Thomas once told me that hope is like a small flame. It doesn't take much to light it, just a little warmth, just a little care. That night at the bus stop, I gave a piece of my heart without asking for anything in return. And somehow, it came back to me bigger and brighter than I ever imagined. Kindness doesn't need a reason. It doesn't need a plan. It only needs a willing heart. One small kindness can find someone lost in the dark and guide them home again. One small kindness can start a circle that never ends. I gave Thomas a scarf and a smile. He gave me forever, and together we learned that even in the coldest winter, kindness can grow a garden of love.